Hello and welcome. We're with Karleah today, who is the author of A Wreck of Seabirds, and we are so excited that you have joined us to find out all about your book, A Wreck of Seabirds, which is shortlisted for CBCA Awards, and the Shadow Judges are very keen to hear from you.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Okay, they've sent me across a list of questions, which I will start with. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with the questions. So they put a lot of thought into the process already. The first question that I have is, where do you get your ideas from?
This is an interesting question. I think, like most writers, I do take a lot of ideas from what I read and what I'm interested in. So this particular novel I wrote as part of my PhD thesis, and I was
Wow.
studying Australian coastal Gothic literature. So I was reading a lot of Australian Gothic and also a lot of contemporary coastal fiction, like Tim Winton and Robert Drew and all that kind of thing. And this particular novel was very inspired by where I live. I live in Perth. I live very close to the coast. It's a very familiar landscape to me. So I was inspired by sort of the Gothic genre and wanting to put it in a coastal setting.
Well, that really makes sense. I could really picture myself when I was reading your book like there. It actually made me want to go.
Yeah.
Because it was the imagery and everything. It really, you did a wonderful job with that. And
Thank
I
you.
was hooked. I actually started your book and read it within 2 days. So I
Awesome.
just want,
Fabulous.
and this was your first novel as well,
Yes.
wasn't? I
Yeah.
can't believe it. Like reading it, I wouldn't have known that. It's like you've been writing for years. So
Oh, thank
wow,
you.
amazing.
I have in a way,
Yeah. So
but first novel, yes.
well, you did your PhD. That's a lot of
Yeah,
writing and
it
research.
is.
It is. So the second question is, what do you find is the most challenging part of writing a book?
Hmm. Another really good question. Um, I think motivation is a big thing. You really have to find the time to commit. So I was really lucky to be able to do this as part of a PhD. And it was one of the reasons I decided to commit to that was because I really wanted to write a book and I really wanted to be published. And I knew that if I did it this way, I would have sort of 3 to 4 years where I had that almost as an excuse to say, I'm at home working on my PhD and it was me
Yeah.
writing my novel. And it was a lot of work, but I felt like it sort of gave me that time. And now
Mm,
that I've finished that and graduated and I'm working again, I'm working on another novel and it's sort of a
oh,
lot more, you know, making it fit and making it fit around like living my life. So I think finding the time to write
yeah.
is the hardest thing for me. Like the ideas are there and, you know,
Mm,
unraveling them and everything I don't find too difficult, but finding the time to actually sit down and do it is probably
yeah.
the hardest part. Yeah.
Right. So with your PhD,
Mm.
did you have to produce the novel at the end?
Yeah, so it's really
Ah.
interesting doing a creative PhD. Normally you would write a thesis of however many
Mm,
thousand words,
yep.
which you do for this, but a big chunk of it is a manuscript. So
Wow.
I ended up with a manuscript of about 60,000 words, and a thesis of about 30,000. So you can go up to 100,000 total.
Yep.
But so it's sort of both of them. But yeah, it's a big part of the PhD.
Awesome. Well, we're glad you did it
Yeah.
because it's a wonderful book, and that research process really came through
Mm.
throughout as well. So the third question I have for you is: do you have a favorite time of day when you feel most inspired to write?
Yeah, so my whole way through uni and doing the PhD, I was very much a night owl sort of a writer where I'll start writing kind of quite late and I would just kind of be on a roll and keep going until 2 or 3 in the morning.
Mhm.
And now that I'm working, I'm working as a barista, so my shifts start at 5:30 in the morning, so I have to get up really early. So I can't
Yeah.
really do that anymore. So now I
No.
have to, come home and do a few hours in the afternoon. I'm in a writing group with a couple of friends and we kind of try and meet up every week and we do a full day of writing.
Oh,
So we'll do a few hours and have lunch and then do a few more hours. So now I just kind of fit it in where I can. Yeah, but it used to be kind of the middle of the night is when I wrote this one. So
Do you find switching it to during the day, are you finding that it's still happening, or is it harder?
it is definitely still happening. I think middle of the night when my brain is kind of ticking over, working a lot is when I get a lot of my ideas. And I think a big
Mm,
part of writing is, sort of working everything over and letting things come to you and letting them
mm.
unfold. So a lot of the story will kind of be there in my head, and it's, at that point it's just a matter of sitting down and getting it out on the page or on the computer. So
Oh, interesting. And with your writing group, are they all authors that are published, or they're looking to publish their books?
no, not yet. So this is a quite new group just of friends who are interested in writing. But when I was at uni, I was in a similar writing group with the kind of cohort of people who were doing their PhD at the same time, and a lot of those women are published or getting published, which is really, really exciting. It's really cool
Yeah.
to that we were able to talk through our projects as they were coming along and developing, and now to see them like exist is really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And the next question, if you weren't a writer, what do you think you would be doing instead?
Would definitely still be doing something to do with books because I love books and reading and I always have.
Yeah.
So before I did always want to be a writer and write books, but before I did my PhD, when I finished my undergrad, I intended to go into publishing.
Mm,
And once I sort of seriously decided to write, I wouldn't do it now because I don't think I could be on both sides of it.
mm.
And I really love writing and I want to keep doing it. But I probably would have done something like publishing. Or I would still really like to own and run a book cafe. My other love
Oh,
is
that sounds
coffee,
amazing.
coffee and baking. So I would probably combine all of those things and do that, which I still hope to do one day. But
Yeah, definitely. That sounds awesome. Do you read the reviews of your books? How do you handle the feedback, both good and not so good?
Occasionally. I don't seek them out very often. Sometimes there'll be a really good review in a particular publication or like a radio review or something that my publisher will send me and say, like, hey, here's a really good one. Or my sister or someone will send them to me. I don't really seek them out. But the ones that I have read, if they sort of say anything negative, most of it is stuff that I would have expected or anticipated.
Mm.
Um, and I don't really let it bother me. I am a big reader and I'm in a couple of book clubs. And you kind of just know that there's going to be books that some
Yeah,
people love and rave about that you like really hate. And you're like,
that's right.
what book are they reading? So I'm sort of so used to it just from being a reader that you're never going to write a book that everyone
No, it's not
enjoys.
for everyone. It
And
depends
there
on.
are some things in this book, in terms of the style and like the narrative and stuff that I totally understand that it would not be for some people. So
Mm,
yeah, I don't let it bother me.
awesome. And the next question, if your book was adapted into a film,
Mm.
who would be your dream cast for the main characters? And I have to admit, I can so see this as becoming a movie. I can, when I read your book, I could actually see the characters, especially your
Yeah.
opening scene on the
Hmm.
beach. I could just see the waves coming in and the
Yeah.
drama between the two
Yeah.
characters. And so crossing fingers, I
Yeah.
really hope, because it's such a good
It's really
Australian
cool that you
story.
said that because that first scene was the same for me. And I was just like out on a walk or something.
Mm,
And I'd been doing all this research, but I didn't have any ideas for the book. And that
wow.
first scene kind of just popped up in my head, almost like I was watching a film. And I
Yeah.
see those, Bryony running along and seeing this boy in the water. And
Yeah.
it was just so vivid in my mind. And I just thought
Mm,
I have to know, what their story is and where it's going. And that's where the whole book started for me. So that's really cool. Um,
mm. Yeah,
in
well, as
terms
a
of
reader,
film,
I that's what hooked me as well.
yeah, that's
I
awesome.
could I could see the cinematic part, I could see it
Yeah,
happening, and then I had to know too, like, what's his
yeah.
story? What's her story? How they've
And
come
the
together?
coast
What's
is
gonna.
such a cinematic landscape.
It
And I've always
is.
loved, I'm not really a beach person in terms of like going and hanging out at the beach, but
Mm.
I love to have it there as a backdrop and I love to look at it and appreciate it.
I think it
Um,
added the drama as
yeah,
well, with
yeah,
the
definitely.
waves and
Yeah,
just the cold with the
yes,
weather not being summer and being,
yeah,
it kind of added the tension. So,
yeah,
yeah, no,
yeah.
that's really
I
interesting.
don't
Who would
think
be your
I have,
dream cast?
I don't know if I have a dream cast because with things like this, I think it's almost better to have sort of up and coming, like
Yeah.
relatively unknown actors. So recently Holden Shepherd's Invisible Boys was adapted on Stan, and like that cast is so brilliant and so perfect for that story. And I
Mm.
didn't know who any of those people were, but I really like that, and I almost think it works better because you're not sort of projecting other characters
Yeah.
you've already played.
Yeah.
It would have to be a fully Australian cast. I would really want it to
Yeah.
be obviously Australian, probably WA if possible,
Yeah.
but
I'd
yeah.
agree with you. It'd be nice to have the local sort of actor
Yeah.
feature that. And yeah, so is it an actual place as well that the actual town it's set in is somewhere near you
The
that you live?
town is not real, so it's a fictionalized
I
town.
thought so. Yeah, but
Um,
based on one?
but you can absolutely go to a lot of the locations and a lot of the inspiration if you have been to Perth or live in Perth. I've had
Mm.
people here say like, oh, this reminded me of this and this. And I said, yeah, it was
Mm.
kind of based on that. So a lot of the locations are definitely real, and then it was fictionalized. I did start writing it set kind of just where I live,
Mm.
which is like a northern suburb of Perth. So it's not super isolated, and I wanted it to feel more isolated. So I made it a, kind of more remote town. Um, but a lot of the inspiration is absolutely real places. Yeah.
And the island, is that real?
So Rottnest Island was my
Oh, Rottnest
inspiration.
Island.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of an island having a really dark history that people kind of cover up. So with Rottnest, I do love Rottnest, and my family would go
Mm.
there for holidays every year. Um, but obviously it does have a very dark past.
Mm.
And I wrote a lot of this novel, or reworked a lot of it, on a writing retreat where I went and stayed on Rottnest by myself
Oh,
in
wow.
winter.
By
And it was,
yourself?
yeah, by myself in winter.
Oh,
And it was
wow.
very much like the vibe. So a
Yeah.
lot of it kind of unfolded then. So it was a big inspiration. But I liked the idea of having this island that had this past, and instead of covering it up, the way we've kind of dealt with it is we've turned it into this holiday
Mm.
destination. But I thought, what if you had this really dark history
Mm.
and it was just sort of left and forgotten about instead? So it is
Buried, yeah.
inspired by Rottnest. If it was that bit further away, that people could really put it out of their minds, and, out of sight, out of mind sort of a thing. Yeah.
It's interesting that you stayed there and you
Mm.
experienced on
Yeah.
your own because I think
Yeah, and
that
it was the
really
first
came
time
through.
because I'd been there for like with my family like a lot
Mm.
over the years, and it was the first time I'd ever been there by myself, but it was
Did you hear the sounds and did that filter through into your
yeah.
writing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
the manuscript really took a turn on that writing retreat, and a lot of it sort of
Oh,
changed quite dramatically, and then all came together, and it was a really important part of the process, I think.
wow. That's really interesting. So what's one piece of advice you would give to aspiring writers?
I think the most important piece of advice I have based on my own experience is to let go of a manuscript before you necessarily think
Mm.
it's ready. Because the way
Mm.
it worked for me, the manuscript was sort of just done like a few weeks before. And then in my mind, it could use so much more work, and I didn't think it was totally ready. I thought the ending needed a lot of work. And my uni supervisor at the time really encouraged me to just start submitting it to things. So I had
Mm.
this list of different awards and like opening times for publishers and things like that I was going to work through. And I ended up submitting it to the Fogarty Award, which is ultimately how it got published.
Oh,
And I didn't think it was ready. But what I've
wow.
kind of realized in hindsight is that those competitions and publishers in general are, they're not looking for a perfect novel, they're looking for like potential. And obviously we did edit it and we did change things about the ending, and you can still do that process.
Mm.
You just have people and like experts who can help you do that. So I think
Mm.
just, yeah, letting it go is probably the most important thing.
That's really interesting because
Like,
I, like you, I thought you'd have to have it fully
yeah,
ready. I mean, I thought you'd
yeah,
have minor editing,
yeah,
but that is really good advice because you could be
yeah.
put off from doing it thinking I have to know how
Yeah,
to do it all
because
myself.
I think it's really hard to, like, I don't think you'll ever have a manuscript that you think is 100% done. Like I could
Mm.
probably read the published version of Rec and find things that I would change.
Yeah,
So I don't think anything creative is ever like a totally done thing.
no.
So I
Yeah.
think you just need to get to that point where you just let it go and put it out there and see what happens.
And having someone from because you'd get so wrapped up in it, writing every
Yeah.
detail, having someone who's never read it before, coming and looking at
Yeah.
objectively from the characters, does this flow?
Yeah.
Because I can imagine that input would have been important as well.
Yeah, definitely.
The next question, does Bryony ever find closure in losing her sister? What happened to Sarah at the end? And was she left to decay and wither with the elements like salt in water?
She was. Bryony didn't ever get closure, which I know is really
Oh
awful.
no, I found that hard.
I know.
But
To me,
grief is like that though,
to me,
isn't
it's a
it?
more
Yeah.
realistic ending.
Yeah.
Especially if you're thinking about, missing persons cases, in real life, so many of them go unsolved and you never get answers. And I think it's really, really horrible. And that thought terrifies me.
Yeah.
But I think it wouldn't have had the same impact if the book had had everything tied up and everything
Mm,
had answers. So I think Bryony reaches a point of acceptance and sort of accepting that she needs to move on with her life and she might never
yeah.
know.
What
In
happened?
my mind, she doesn't ever know.
Yeah.
You can imagine it differently if you like. You can imagine that someone finds Sarah's body, but I don't think so.
Hard to imagine how that would happen,
Yeah,
the way it was. So I came to the same conclusion
yeah,
and I thought, yeah, she's not going to know, which is really
yeah.
sad.
And I think Aria, being there, being in the hospital was sort of
Mm,
almost like a last ditch effort at hope for Bryony. And so when Arya passed away, I think that was sort of the moment that Bryony thought, okay, I have to,
yeah.
live my life and, maybe leave this behind in this little.
Was it tempting? Because I was thinking she was going to say something. Just,
Mm.
I was reading, I'm like, is she going to say something? And I remember that part with the doctors.
That was, it was
Yeah,
never how I was going to end it.
right.
I really wanted it to have that frustration.
Yeah,
You're
yep.
so close to everything lining up perfectly. Um, and then it doesn't.
It
So I
was
really wanted
realistic
it
though.
to be like right there. So you're, sort of like
Yeah, it was
screaming at
right
the
there.
page.
I was.
And a lot of the stuff that
Yeah,
Ren knew as well and that his father knew, like it all
yeah.
comes so close to lining up, but I didn't want it to. So I always knew that it was going to end like that, which is,
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
yeah.
And the next question, how come Sarah, Arya, and the pre-deceased scientist that dwelled on the island saw the same hallucination? Does that mean the figure was real or the side effects were the same?
Um, I don't think the figure was real, but it was very real to them.
Mm.
So I wanted everything to come back to the water. So obviously the water in terms of the
Mm,
ocean is this thing that is trapping all these characters and keeping them there. And it's this sort of, big force. But I really wanted the water element to also be the thing that was, scaring them and terrifying them and being the thing. So it was the water being contaminated was
mm,
making them hallucinate.
yeah,
And the paranoia, like a lot of the paranoia they experienced came from them reading those journals. So I
yeah,
think the guy writing the journals had these hallucinations that were very particular to him. And if he hadn't
yeah.
been reading those journals, the girls might have been seeing completely different things. So I think it was, a result of them reading this and having it sort of imprint onto their reality. So they
Mm,
were seeing the same thing just because they were sort of reading that story.
yeah,
Kind of like if you're alone at night reading a horror novel, you
yeah.
probably,
You're looking for it,
start to
then you're
hear
more
it.
aware.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. How do you create and sustain a motive throughout a narrative without it being becoming repetitive?
That's a good question because I don't think I was aware the whole time that I was using like birds as a motif
Mm,
necessarily. And then I got to a point where I realized it. Um, and then I put some in more intentionally. Um, I don't know because it could have easily become quite repetitive, I think, because
mm,
obviously I was writing about coastal settings and there are
yeah,
seagulls and osprey and like birds are kind of like a big part of
mm,
that setting.
yeah.
Um, I don't know, really.
I
It
think
was
it
an
snuck
important
in. I
motif,
found
but
it, it wasn't, it just sort of popped up and
it just
then
kind of worked. Yeah.
different parts. it sort of came together. And
Mm.
I liked that. It's like it was because I wondered with the title originally. I thought, oh, Wreck of Sea, but then I sort of got the boat,
Mm.
and then I wasn't sure about the birds, and then the birds became scary. I
Yeah.
thought maybe that was
Yeah.
freaking me out. And I thought then I could see different parts of how it all tied together, and it was
Yeah.
really I thought it was cleverly done. It wasn't overdone like you would immediately say birds,
Yes.
but it was sprinkled through, which was
Yeah.
really interesting. So I think from your point of view, it wouldn't have been easy to do that. It could probably
Mhm.
be easier to overwhelm you with the emotive than do it more
Yeah.
delicately.
Yeah.
And the next question, what was the most difficult part of writing A Wreck of Seabirds?
Mm. Um, so when I did that writing retreat, I did have, like I said, I had a sort of moment where a lot of it changed. Changing it was really hard for me because I'd put a lot of time into the manuscript and it was maybe halfway, and it was very different at that point.
Oh.
I only had the two timelines, and it was Ren and Bryony, and then I had Sarah and Arya's timeline, but they were both on the mainland. And Arya was sort of watching Ren and Bryony's story unfold, and she was reflecting on the story of her and Sarah. And in
Mm.
that original manuscript, there was a body that washed up right at the beginning, and the
Oh,
twist at
right.
the end was that Arya watching them had been dead this whole time. So you sort of had the
Oh,
story unfold, but she was like kind of a ghost, I
yeah,
guess.
right.
Um, and something about it wasn't really working. I
Mm.
didn't hate it, but something about it wasn't really
Wasn't gelling.
working.
Yeah.
And I was trying to write a gothic novel, and it didn't feel super gothic to me. It felt quite contemporary,
Mm.
almost like a contemporary murder mystery vibe, which is fine. It just wasn't what I was trying to write. And then when I stayed on Rottnest and sort of had that landscape all around me, that's when the island came to me.
Mm.
And at some point, I thought, now we have the backstory for Bryony's missing person. Maybe we need the backstory for Ren's missing person. And that's when I
Mm.
decided to add that third narrative strand. But at that point, I had this huge chunk of manuscript that I wasn't going to be able to use at all because I was
Mm.
moving the setting, I was moving sort of the whole concept. So I kind of had to just delete like half of what I'd done.
Oh,
And like
wow.
making that decision, like I was kind of at a point where I knew I had to do it because I knew it wasn't working. But
Yeah.
like making the decision to actually just like scrap all of that work was
Yeah.
hard. So that was probably the hardest part for me.
That would be all that time
Yeah.
invested.
But
But
after
then
I
with,
did that, it kind of
yeah.
came together so easily, and the whole story made sense to me. And so
Mm.
it had to happen, and it was really important, but it was
And it's part of the process, I
a
guess.
difficult step to take, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would be. I had another question related to the motif as well. The motif of seabirds recurs throughout the novel. What do these birds represent to you? Are they a metaphor for grief, memory, or something else?
So the biggest, I guess, symbolism for birds for me is freedom. And I
Mm.
was playing around a lot with that idea of
Mm.
freedom while I was writing about entrapment and isolation. So a lot of what I was looking at when I was studying Australian Gothic was this idea of freedom or lack of freedom. And the thing I find most interesting about Australian Gothic fiction is that it takes this landscape, the Australian landscape, that sort of represents freedom in
Mm.
a way. So a lot of what will trap characters in Australian Gothic fiction is like the more internal landscapes, like the outback, and they'll be looking out at this vast open space, and it's sort of just this abundance of space which should symbolize freedom, but it
Mm.
actually ends up feeling like it's trapping you. And I always found that really interesting about the
Mm.
Australian Gothic genre, and I thought it's kind of the same thing if you had like settlers looking
Yeah.
out to sea, because it looks like it's this, expanse and it should be freeing, but in reality, that space and that distance and that ocean is the thing that is trapping them here. So I kind of
Right.
really like that interplay of the thing that should offer freedom not doing that. And to
Mm.
me, birds really do just represent freedom. And
Mm.
I think that's why I thought that was so interesting.
Is that because they can just fly wherever they
Yeah.
want,
Yeah,
or
they can just
yeah,
go, they can
they
leave.
can just go, yeah, whereas humans are limited by
Yeah.
boat. And then I was
Mhm.
interesting, with the boat failing.
Yeah.
So are they all symbols as well of
Yeah.
being trapped? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question, the ending of your novel leaves so much unresolved. Was that a deliberate choice? What
Mm.
did you want your readers to sit with after they finish the book?
It was a deliberate choice. So like I said, I was trying to write a Gothic novel, and something that I really love about the Gothic, and I have friends who don't like the Gothic genre for this same reason, but it's something that I really love about it is the ambiguity.
Mm,
Um, One of the first Australian Gothic novels that I read, and still one of my favorites, is Picnic at Hanging Rock, which
mm,
obviously has that very ambiguous ending where you never know what happened to those schoolgirls. Um, and I loved it. Like it kind of haunts me. And every time I go, my grandma has a farm in New South Wales, and the landscape looks very much like the, setting in Picnic at Hanging Rock. And every time I go, I think about it, and I think about these schoolgirls in the white
mm,
petticoats like vanishing. So it really stuck with me.
mm,
And I found out a few years ago that Joan Lindsay actually did write a final chapter to that novel that
mm.
gives you the answer and tells you what happened to them. So I read it and I hated it, and it really ruins the book. Um,
Yeah.
I don't recommend seeking it out. And I think it was actually a decision her editor made and kind of said we should cut off this final chapter. And then
Yeah.
they published it like that. And it really does make the book and make the
Mm.
story. And reading it with the ending, it just wouldn't stick with you the same way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and it's not just in Picnic at Hanging Rock; it's in a lot of Gothic fiction. And that ambiguity I really, really like. So I did,
Mm.
yeah. I knew I wanted my book to have that kind of ending.
Would you ever write a sequel, or like to continue on with their stories, or do you think that
I
that's
don't.
finished there?
I think it's done.
Yeah.
If I were to write anything connected to it, um, I've thought about writing Ren's story in between.
Mm.
So he kind of alludes a little bit to leaving this town at 14 and being really angry about what happened to his
Yes.
brother and really emotional and really struggling with that. So I would probably write a prequel of Ren's teenage
Yep.
years and him sort of growing up with all those big emotions to get him to this point where he comes back. That's
Mm.
probably the only thing that I think I could still write for it. But I don't think I will. I don't think it really needs
Yeah.
it.
Yep.
But if I was going to write anything, it would probably be a prequel.
Okay. There are strong suggestions of the supernatural, psychological trauma, and even nuclear experimentation. Was Wreck Island intended to be interpreted literally, symbolically, or both?
I think I like the idea that you can interpret it the way that most scares you. So another thing that I really love about Gothic is that it's reality, but there's something about it that's really unsettling, and you don't know what it is.
Mm.
And that's sort of my favorite thing about the Gothic genre. So I did want it to feel like that. I wanted it to sort of have all these suggestions that it could be this, it could be this, and it could be something supernatural, or it could be something totally normal. Like that they're ingesting something that's
Mm.
contaminated or poisonous, or so I wanted it to kind of have those options where you didn't know what was going on, um, because that's sort of the big thing about the Gothic for me is it puts you in something that could be real, and then it's like, is this really happening or is it in my head?
Mm.
And which of those things is scarier? Is it scarier if you can explain it as something like a thing that like a monster or something supernatural, or is it scarier if your mind is like making this up for you? Like which of those things is
Mm.
more terrifying? So I don't know if I have a solid answer to that one, but
I think it depends on, I guess, you as well, what you
yeah.
interpret as a reader. But I found the setting ground made it more scary for me because it was so
Mm,
realistic.
yeah.
I've been to WA, and I'm being Australian. I could strongly see it all
Yeah.
happening, and
Yeah.
so for me that was terrifying. Just imagine being there
Yeah.
stuck.
I think that's one of the coolest things. You can put yourself in almost any natural
Mm,
landscape in Australia. I had the same experience staying down in Pemberton in the Karri forests, but I think you can kind of put yourself in any landscape and you know, you can just conjure up all these things that terrify you. It's so easy to do.
Even having to survive, I found
Yeah,
that element really
yeah,
interesting too. What would happen? We're so
mm,
used to just going to Coles or Woolworths and finding, having
yeah,
to actually work out what can I eat, what can I
yeah.
not.
And what would you do is kind of the, what would you do in that situation? Because I had a couple of people say to me, oh, why
Mm,
wouldn't they just swim back straight away? And in my mind, like with the distance I'd put it, and I don't really,
mm,
I find the ocean quite terrifying and the idea of open water quite terrifying.
yeah,
And I was like, in my mind, if I was with someone and I wasn't alone, I don't think I would try to swim
yeah,
personally, but obviously
yeah.
that's like depends on you, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. The next question. Bryony and Ren both experience unresolved trauma and carry guilt. How did you approach writing mental health in a nuanced and realistic way?
Mm. I wanted to, I really wanted to write about these sort of big emotions and things that people often think can be quite shameful. So I wanted to, particularly with Ren, I wanted to write him having these big sort of conflicting emotions because he has a lot of blame and a lot of anger that from one perspective is quite misplaced. It's not really fair of him to have this anger for like his father, for example, but he can't help that he feels that. So I think I wanted to present those sort of emotions that maybe are not the ones that you want to show to people, but you can't help your reaction to something and you can't help how you feel. You can,
Mm,
you can help how you respond to something like outwardly, but you can't help how you feel. So that was really important to me to show. Um in terms of dealing with it, I don't know. It's just kind of who the characters were for me, and I just wrote them in a way that I felt was honest. Um,
I like the support that they gave
mm,
each other.
yeah.
I thought that it's good to your writing can
Mhm,
influence
yeah.
people the same age to did
Mhm.
you ever think that in your mind that other readers might say, you know what, I can see someone struggling, I'm going to
Mm.
offer my support, and not it's so easy just to walk away when you confront it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing because I had that first scene kind of come to me and it was Bryony coming across this guy in the water. And I
Mm,
kind of thought, what would you do in that situation? Would you
mm,
approach someone who
yeah.
looked like they were in that sort of vulnerable state? And a
Mm,
lot of people wouldn't. Um, and you have no obligation to, obviously, but it came down to, I think, Bryony having her own
yes.
stuff going on and she had been at really low points where she had people like her brother to support her. So I think sometimes if people have that sort of empathy that comes from their own experiences, it's a bit different. And then their relationship, Ren and Bryony's relationship, really I think developed the way that it did because it started in such a vulnerable place. It started when Ren was already not hiding anything. So it's like what you would move forward just kind of naturally without putting those walls back up because they weren't there
Mm,
like when it started, which I really liked.
yeah. And the interwoven timelines, I'm really interested to hear
Mm.
about how if that was complex and how you managed to do that. The interwoven timelines and perspectives give the novel a haunting atmosphere. Why did you choose to structure the narrative this way?
So I really liked something I was playing around with that I really liked was the idea of sort of layering the timelines. I like this idea that you can take a landscape and everything that's happened there is sort of still happening
Mm,
depending on how you perceive time. But all of these things that have unfolded are still there, sort of underneath your
mm,
current narrative. So I really wanted it to step back through the timelines. And having it sort of told in three separate parts to me wouldn't have that same idea of it being layered. So that's sort of where the short fragments came from. I also liked that it's to me it felt like you were being pulled in and out of time a little bit and the idea of the three storylines and I've called them the shore, the shallows and the deep. The idea
mm,
is that the further back in time you go, the further out to sea you're getting. So it's sort of pulling you in and out. It's meant to mimic the tide pulling you in and out to shore and back. So
mm.
that's sort of why. So I really wanted it to have that feeling of pull and lure and sort of like constant movement, to mimic the ocean in that way.
One thing I found interesting was it was the same body of water.
Mm.
And so much had happened, and a
Yeah.
lot of they just kept coming back to the same
Yeah.
place. And so,
Yes.
how it impacts different
Mm.
people. Nothing else changes. Like someone else, I think you mentioned that someone walking past would see something so beautiful, but to
Yeah.
someone else who've experienced a trauma or
Yeah.
something like that would just see it in such a
Yeah, that
different way.
doesn't go away. And
Yeah.
a big part of the Gothic, again, which I keep going back to,
Mm. No, it's
but a big
important.
part of the Gothic is that it's about repressed trauma, and it's about the return of the past into the present. And it
Right.
is sort of that idea that, something has happened here, and it sort of forces itself on you and like asserts itself in this way. So that was really kind of there in the back of my mind as well.
Awesome. And can you tell us anything about your next book? Is it Gothic?
Yeah, it is Gothic.
Oh,
Um,
awesome.
I think it's gonna be a bit darker. So when I started researching for this, not necessarily for this book because I didn't know what the book was going to be, but when I started researching for the PhD, I did a lot of research on like ocean, like myths and legends, like
Mm,
mythology. And I looked at a lot more kind of fantasy stuff. I read a lot of Little Mermaid retellings, and a lot about like mermaids and sirens and selkies and all of that kind of
mm,
thing, which I thought was really, really cool. And it didn't end
mm,
up playing out in this book, but all of that stuff is still kind of like hovering around up there. So book two is more selkie inspired.
mm.
Definitely gothic, like definitely coastal gothic, but it's probably going to play more into the body horror aspect. It'll still be WA. I think I'm going to set it in
Oh,
Albany.
lovely.
Yeah,
Oh,
but I'm
fantastic. I look
working.
forward to it. I'm
Yeah.
so excited. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
your
welcome.
time. The Shadow Judges will be watching this and will be very grateful that you've taken the time out to share all of this with it. It's really interesting when you've read the book and then
Mm.
hearing, how
Yeah.
it came about
It was
and
really cool because I've done a few interviews, but this one's cool because everyone's already read it, so we can like talk about the
yeah.
ending and like,
It
yeah,
is. And yeah, I can see now why, at first I was like, why isn't there an ending? Like,
yeah,
in that moment you finish and
yeah,
like I knew why, but it
yeah,
was kind of, that frustration.
yes,
But then after you let it
definitely,
sit for a while, you're like, because then it keeps floating. Your book is
yeah.
still floating in and out of my mind,
Oh, good. I'm glad.
which is that's how you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, that it's had an impact. And I'm sure a
yeah.
lot of the shadow judges would feel the same way. And hopefully we get to see a movie later down the track. But
That would be
thank
incredible.
yeah, awesome. So thank you for your time and
Thank
for being with
you.
us today.
Thank you.